Pricing power, the term great business, I think is a term that's used a lot, but very seldomly defined. And there's different kinds of pricing power, just like there's different kinds of great businesses. And it's so important to, I think, think carefully about it. So just take an example. I think I mentioned Dun & Bradstreet before, and I don't want to. I shouldn't pick on a particular company. But I actually have an investment in that space, which is why it's on my mind. But there's a point where you raise prices aggressively because you have a great market position. That's a finite. There's only a finite amount of time you can do that, because eventually you're going to run up against the value that you're giving to your customers. No matter how great your market position is, your product or service is a finite value. And so you can only, and so sometimes if you look at a history of large price increases, I think that the normal reaction is to say, wow, what a great business. They've raised prices at 5% for the past 20 years, every single year. It's great. But the way I think about that is they've very aggressively sort of been using up whatever finite amount of pricing power they have, and I'm worried that it's ending. And I made my biggest investment mistake was a company called Ambassadors Group, and I made a lot of mistakes in that investment thesis, and only one of them was that it had sort of overpriced its product in the marketplace. I looked back and I saw that it was actually raising prices at double-digit rates, sort of over the past 5 years when I made the investment, and it was a great product and all that. But what I did not recognize is that they'd overpriced their product, which exacerbated problems that they later had. And so now when I think about pricing power, I think of it very differently. So there's two. Let's just go back to the fundamental idea of pricing power. There's nominal pricing power, and then there's real pricing power. So nominal pricing power we can define as the ability to raise your prices with your cost inflation, to offset your cost inflation. So even that is often talked about as a key strength. This company can offset cost inflation. And if you can do that in real time as opposed to on a lag basis, that's much better, right? But overall, if that's all you can do, that's good, but it's not that great, because if you can't do that, you're in a really bad position. I mean, you're in a really bad position, and it's hard to imagine how your business is attractive if you can't offset your cost inflation. So it's almost just a prerequisite. It's not this great thing. It's a prerequisite, and it's not something that I get really excited about. But real pricing power is different. Real pricing power we can define as the ability to raise prices in excess of your cost inflation. You're taking a little bit more of the earning power of your customer, every year, and that is very powerful and valuable because it results in margin expansion. And the math of that is very compelling. If you have 5% operating margins and you raise prices by 1% in excess of your cost inflation, that 1% is 20% of 5%. And so you're taking only 1% of your customers' earning power extra, but you're increasing your operating income by 20%. That's really, really great. And so, ironically, the best situation is actually to have big real pricing power on low margins. So that has implications for when you look at things. But anyway, so real pricing power is very powerful, but it's very rare. It's very unusual. And why is it unusual? Well, it's because companies, I think, are pretty good at taking what they can get for their products. Over a long period of time, they sort of figure out how to extract from their customers what they can get, and no more and no less. It's a competitive product market, and the existence of underpriced products might be considered an inefficiency, where a company isn't getting. And just like in the securities markets, there are inefficiencies, but they're just, they're not the norm, but they exist. So one interesting thing to do is to look for where there might be inefficiencies in product markets with respect to the pricing of the products, like you do look for inefficiencies in securities markets. And so you might look for a company that has been actually a non-profit organization for a lot of its history. Non-profit organization doesn't have a profit motive in a traditional sense, so maybe it hasn't sought to extract all of the value it can out of it, all the revenue it can extract. And so a good example of that is a company called Verisk Analytics, which it began as an insurance cooperative pooling data for insurance companies. This is going back a long time ago, to the early 1900s. insurance companies would pool their data for the purpose of a better actuarial analysis, and they would collectively own, the cooperative. And Verisk existed in that form until it converted to a for-profit, I think in the early 90s. And then it went public, in the late 90s. So it converted to a for-profit corporation in 1997, I think. And it's funny, in that conversion, the employees took 15% of the company. They took 15% of the equity. And some of the members, the owners, who are the big P&C insurance companies, were really against it. But eventually they sort of relented because they were worried about their reliance on this organization. They didn't want to create acrimony with this newly independent organization, and which is it's a very good indication of the power this organization has. And so now, Verisk went public a couple years ago, and if you look at the gap between the price and value, it's enormous. Their estimate is that for their most value-added products, the return on investment of their customers is sort of 30 times, and for their least value-added products, it's 5x. So that obviously, that's that gap between price and value of a product and a service that is indicative of pricing power. But what's interesting is that when you look at the history, what you're not looking for is price increases. What you're looking for is actually lack of price increases, a lack of pricing. And that's what really gives you the very powerful pricing power potential in the future. Another example is railroads. Real rates in the railroad industry declined by about half since deregulation, and then the industry consolidated, and in 2004 they started to raise rates. And so if you looked, that was a great moment for the railroad industry. And if you looked at the history, you were actually seeing real rates declining for a long period of time. And so that's what you really want to look for, I think, when you look for pricing power.